This is Apply the Salesforce CLI to Everyday Problems. I am Peter Chittum. I'm a developer evangelist. I also lead the developer evangelist teams in US and Europe. I've been around for a while. I'm coming up on 10 years at Salesforce. It's like 9.5 right now. No, it's more like 9 in a few months, actually. That's my email address. That's my Twitter handle. Feel free to contact me either way. I do have open direct messages on Twitter. Please be nice. That's all I'll say. This is our forward-looking statement slide. It's the new improved 2019 version, but it still basically says, if I make any forward-looking statements today, don't use any information to make any purchasing decisions. And that's pretty much it, nice and short. I also like to thank the Manchester developer and user groups who hosted me about a year ago when I was prepping this talk last year. Because this is meant to be everyday problems of you, our customers and our partners, not everyday problems of Peter, the developer evangelist. And so they helped me workshop a number of really great ideas, and they came up with some problems that they wanted to solve that I thought really add a lot to this talk. So I'll try and cover some of those as we go along. I do like to do some really baseline stuff in this talk. So command line interface is what CLI stands for. Just in case you were wondering. Now, the Salesforce command line interface, or CLI, is part of our Salesforce Developer tools. It's one part of many different tools that we use as developers. And even as, you don't have to be a coder to take advantage of this. And it's something I try and stress a lot. When you look at the command line, you're not really writing code. You're writing declarative statements in a user interface. That's really what you're doing. And we actually use command line interfaces every day, even though we might not know it. If you've ever entered a URL into a web browser or done a Google search and used like the minus to remove a search term, or done advanced searches on Google Calendar or Google Mail or Gmail, all of those things are technically command line interfaces. One reason I give this talk is because when I've talked about adopting and using the Salesforce command line, I've often gotten the response back, well, I would use the CLI, Peter, but we don't use Salesforce DX. And I like to make it really clear that the tools and the APIs that comprise Salesforce DX, there's a lot of those actually. And the way that we actually think of Salesforce DX, does anyone know what the DX stands for? Exactly. So if you are writing code, you are using Salesforce DX in a sense. Now, granted, Apex has been around for a long time and predates that project that we called Salesforce DX. But if you're using a developer tool with Salesforce, we think of that as Salesforce DX. Everything up there on that big wheel is Salesforce DX. And really, it's a buffet, right? So you don't automatically use every single developer tool. You use the tools that work for you today. And I would argue that anybody can start to use the command line any day and find good use out of it. So yes, it's a buffet, not a fixed menu, not a set menu. So use the pieces that work. Again, just to define terms, we call it the Salesforce command line very specifically, not the Salesforce DX command line, because it actually has, we're trying to get it adopted throughout the Salesforce product set that deal with developers. So there are actually plugins now that work with the Salesforce command line for Analytics Cloud, for instance. It's not just Salesforce DX. In other words, it's not just core platform. I think of this as I can connect my laptop to my org. I can access common APIs on my org that help my developer workflow. And it's universal. It's built with the Oak Cliff framework. That's the open source, open CLI framework that Heroku open sourced about 2 years ago now. And so it works on any operating system. It'll work on your Windows machine, your Mac machine. I'm going to demo today mostly on Mac because logistically I'm having trouble figuring out how to get 2 machines to sit up here. But I do use both. And last time I gave this talk at Trailhead DX, it was recorded, and I was mostly showing stuff using Windows. and PowerShell. So rest assured, and it's a good time to do another poll. Who here uses a Mac or Linux as your operating system? Okay, so you are the Unix folks. And who here uses Windows of some flavor? Yeah, very good. If you're using Windows, who prefers PowerShell? Yeah. I don't know, Peter. I just know that I'm using Windows. That's cool. That's an answer, too. Who prefers the command line, the old CMD? A few people. Old school, yeah. Actually, I prefer PowerShell today, I'll be honest. But I grew up with, I am that old. Actually, I grew up with VAX VMS. That was my first system that I worked on, going back that far. The other cool thing about the Salesforce command line is that you can write custom plugins for this. And I've put a link in the little, that nice little handy sign down there. Do a nice little shout out to Shane McLaughlin. He works on our platform marketing team. He's a technical platform marketer, excellent developer, and he's written a plugin that has had pretty good adoption himself. He also curates this GitHub repo, which is just an index of all of the known Salesforce command line plugins that are out there. So if the command line, the core plugins don't do what you want them to do, go take a look there and see. There's some pretty cool stuff that's been added. And even just recently, there are some new ones. Any command line skeptics? Anyone sort of came here thinking, well, it's like, do I really need to use the command line, Peter? Because, you do hear this as well, which is, command lines are unintuitive, they're difficult to use, they're slow, there's a lot of typing, and these are all potentially fair critiques. But the nice thing is that modern command lines tend to have a much better user experience. So things like Z Shell and PowerShell give you great features like type ahead and autofill, so that you don't have to remember every single thing, like what directory am I in, for instance, or how do I go up to that directory. And generally speaking, I love using the command line for things that are repetitive. I love the flexibility. I love the composability. In other words, command line commands tend to really follow the principle of do one thing and one thing well. And they have features that allow you to take the results from one and sort of pipe it into another called a pipeline. And when you compose those things together, you can kind of do things that are, I think they're almost greater than the sum of the parts, the way that you can do things. And like I said, command lines are for coders and non-coders. Who here doesn't really consider themselves a coder this morning? Any admins, non-coders? Great, I'm really glad you're here. What I would say is if you watch this talk and it's kind of getting a little overwhelming, go watch this other talk that I did called If You Can Write a Salesforce Formula, You Can Use a Command Line. Because there are a lot of similarities to how you compose like multiple nested functions in a formula or formula field, and how command line commands pass data from one to another. Because in essence, they're both sort of functions in a Salesforce formula, and command line commands really follow functional principles. And so they actually compose very similarly, although I would argue command line commands are more intuitive as opposed to having like 10 nested functions and trying to figure out what that looks like. In any case, check out that talk if this feels a little bit advanced, what I go through. Oops, my HDMI is popping out. So if this feels a little bit advanced, go check out this video, watch it, and then I actually have some links in this particular talk to some more like command line basic stuff and how to get started. So what are the things that the Salesforce command line can do? This is kind of an alphabetical order. There's things around Apex, authorization and logging in. Data management is one piece. Now, it isn't a replacement for a full-on data management or ELT solution, but there are certain data management tasks that can be very, very effective with the command line. Certainly packaging, and those people who have given me the feedback of I don't use Salesforce DX, often one of the things that they are thinking about is I don't use packaging, the next generation packaging features. And that's cool, because I'm going to show you you don't have to use packaging to use Salesforce DX. We also have limits, org management, and some people might just be thinking scratch orgs. which is one of the key features that we launched with the Salesforce command line. But you can also do sandbox org management from the command line as well. So it's not just scratch orgs. And I would say of those people who say, I don't use Salesforce DX, the probably most common thing that those people are telling me is that they don't use scratch orgs. And I'm here to tell you, if you don't use scratch orgs, you can still use the command line. And then, of course, some other useful things like schema, user. User is fairly limited as far as the direct access user command. But remember, user is also data. And so you can actually change user records using those data management commands as well. All right, just to deconstruct, speaking of data management, just to deconstruct a Salesforce CLI command, every command starts with sfdx. This is the core Salesforce command line runtime. And then the next thing is going to be the command itself, which is actually a plugin. So remember I said you can have custom plugins, right? Well, that's what this force data record get is. So that's a JavaScript plugin or a TypeScript plugin that we've written, of course. Who wants to take a guess what this does? Yeah, it gets a record. It reads one record. You get all the fields back. It's pretty straightforward stuff. Most of the command line commands are very intuitive like this. There are a few that may not be, particularly around authorization. You have to do a little bit of reading about those, but mostly they're fairly intuitive. So if I needed to get a record, what would I need to tell my command line? An ID, yes. Which record? What else? What type of object? Absolutely, right? What's the S object or the Salesforce object? There's one other thing. Yes, the org, and I need to be what to get into an org? A user, yes. So, and that's all wrapped up into one OAuth token, basically, that says this user can go and get this org. Now, the OAuth token is nicely encrypted on our file system, and we just simply have to reference it at the end there with that -u org alias, or you can use a username as well. So you can either reference that authorized OAuth token via alias or username. You'll see with scratch orgs why you don't want to have to know the username. They're kind of messy looking. But if you have like developer edition orgs with fairly simple usernames, that's actually pretty handy to have them. So the -w is one option for fetching a record. So think of it as like where in a SQL query. If you have a record ID, you can do a -i and then pass in your 18-digit or 18-character Salesforce ID as an alternative. So that's an either or, either -w or -i. That'll tell us the record. And of course, -s for the S object. Hey, see that? You guys already know how to use a command line collectively. So how cool is that? All right. So as I said, it's a buffet. There's a lot of things we can do. I'm going to go through a few of these things because actually I've got a pretty good amount of time. It says 36 minutes left. That can't be right. I've got like 20 minutes left. That sounds more right. Okay. Cool. So what I'll do is go through about 10 minutes of demoing things. And then maybe a little bit longer, and then we'll have some Q&A just in case anyone has any questions. So by the way, a lot of the things I'm going to talk about are in this GitHub repo. In addition to that, this GitHub repo also has a number of both Bash and PowerShell scripts that I've written that kind of allow you to get a little bit more bang for your buck with some of the Salesforce command line commands. I don't have every single command written in both Bash and PowerShell, but that's just more because this talk has evolved where I was only doing things with Bash, and then I kind of added the PowerShell stuff after. So take a look there if you want. All right, so the first thing I want to talk about is setting up your local environment. And so give me a readout. Those of you in the back, can you see okay? Yes? Okay, I'm seeing yes. Actually, would one of you in the back please grab that blue water bottle sitting on that table and bring it to me. I would really be grateful. I happened to leave it back there. Apparently I need a lot of help this morning, so. But you know, we're all one Ohana, right? So in a bash environment, what I'm going to do, thank you very much. I have a sticker for you later. I've got more too, it's not just him, so. All right, so whether you're using bash or PowerShell, one of the things you're going to want to do is set up your environment so that you can have some things like shortcuts, you know, commonly used commands, and that sort of thing. So I'm actually using Z shell, or as the Brits say where I live, Z shell. And so that profile is a file called ZSHRC. And of course, in Unix, the dot, actually, yeah, we'll just do that. Code dot. We'll just open it right up. So this is my Z shell profile. And the way that this works is that it's actually going to run this anytime I open up a new shell. There we go. And if you take a look right there, I've declared a whole bunch of aliases. And if you notice, right, all I'm doing is taking some of those Salesforce command line commands and simplifying them. So like instead of having to write sfdx force org list to see all of my authorized orgs in this environment, I can just type that dx list command, and I've saved myself a little bit of time. And remember, this is what I was saying about, there are lots of tools available in modern command lines to improve the developer experience. Now, aliases aren't actually new. ZShell has some other things as well that kind of set it apart. So that's kind of my environment setup. I think those are all the ones I want to do there. Now, I've got a slide that I'll come back to. So if you're going to be looking at the slides later, there are 4 files in PowerShell that you can use to set up your profile. Normally what you want to do is you want to set up the one that works for your user for all environments, or all shells, in other words. So that way, whether you're logged into the ISE, the integrated scripting environment for PowerShell, or whether you're logged in directly to PowerShell, or whether you're accessing PowerShell like through Visual Studio Code, those are all different ways to do it. All of those environments will use the same things. Now, in the case of PowerShell, aliases work a little bit different, and so what I've found really useful is just declaring functions. And with functions, you can do things like pass in parameters and that sort of thing. They're sort of like mini scripts, and you can encapsulate them all in your profile. So those are a few things with regards to setup. Now, of course, one thing that you're going to want to do is you're going to want to authorize a bunch of orgs. And so we actually, let's clear that out. And let's just, yeah, OK. So if you recall, my alias was dx list. And that's actually going to do force org list. So I can actually see all of the authorized orgs. I can see them both by username and by the org alias itself. So remember, in my example on the slide, I didn't reference a username. I referenced a shortened name for my org. So those are all of the orgs that are up there. Now, there's 2 orgs that are standing out. This one with the D is my dev hub. If I'm using Scratch orgs, my dev hub is how Salesforce is going to track my license usages of Scratch orgs. So we need to track it somewhere. Which org is going to be your dev hub? Anyone want to take a guess? Your production. Yeah, exactly. If you have multiple orgs, so any multi-org customers out there today, what you're probably going to want to do is pick a subset of those orgs or assign the dev hub depending on the development team. Like those would be the 2 strategies I think that would work the best. All right, so you can see here I've got this df19 org with the -u. That is my default org for this particular project. And the cool thing about that is this can be a Scratch org, this can be a sandbox, It could be a developer edition org, so it doesn't have to be a scratch org. Remember I said you can use the Salesforce command line, you can use this without having to use scratch orgs, and you can start using our modern tools. Well, this kind of demonstrates that. In fact, I have another org up here. Where are you? I'm trying to remember what you called last night. Where are you? Not that one. Not that one. All right, I swear I had an org authorized. I'll come back to that. Okay. Oh, actually, you know how I can find that out? If I do sfdx force source deploy, because I did this last night, it's source SBX, that one right there. Okay, so this right here, there we go. That is, this source SBX is a sandbox that I've authorized. And it's as easy as just changing a setting locally to make that my default org for deploying in this particular environment. Now, what does it mean for this to be my default org? It means when I execute a command, I don't have to explicitly specify the org. So for instance, if I go back here, and I do force data sockle query minus q select ID from property underscore C. Notice I'm not explicitly stating the org at this point. I can simply enter that in, and it will go out. It'll do the query. And why isn't that liking that? That's strange. Oh, I know why. All right, so let's take a step back. So I've authorized, because I didn't deploy that. Yeah. All right, so let me take a step back here. When I create a scratch org, authorization is automatic. The other way I can authorize is by explicitly doing that. So sfdx force auth, and I can actually see that there are several different auth commands to use. Okay. If I'm going to authorize an org with JWT, I can do that here. I can also do auth web login. So those are two ways that I can explicitly identify a credential that I'm then going to store. Now, sfdx URL store is also a really handy tool because what I can do is take an authorization URL, pass it to somebody else, and then they can actually store that authorization locally on their machine. And so the way that I get that authorization URL, there we go, is by force org display verbose. And I'm not going to worry too much about you seeing these org credentials because it's a scratch org. It's going to go away very soon anyway. But if you see this long line down here where it says sfdx auth URL, I can take that, parse it out to a text file, and then I can store that, I can pass that to another developer, and then they can store it on their machine. So if I did that with JSON, and then I pipe that to JQ, and we'll say, give me the raw output, and there's a result JSON object with sfdx URL store. That should output just that raw value of the authorization URL. And why didn't it? Let's just do without the JSON. I feel like I'm missing something there. It's probably... There we go. Oh, there we go. It would help to write the right. So JQ minus R dot result dot sfdx auth URL. There we go. Okay, cool. So now I can take that and I can put it into a text file. So this will be my org key.txt. There we go. And if I cat that out, you can see that all I have is just that URL. I can literally pass that to another developer. I mean, in theory, you could give it to Salesforce support, and they could authorize onto this org just as easily as well. So it's a really handy tool if you just want to pass credentials around. I would strongly recommend not doing that with your production org. Just saying. But for Scratch orgs, Developer Edition orgs, Sandboxes, think how easy this is to actually share out so that other users can access your development environment, for instance. Okay? All right, so once I've done authorization, if I have a Scratch org, then I can start to use the Source Sync API. The Source Sync API is what allows Salesforce to know that something has changed locally, and so I can push just that change to an org. Or conversely, something has changed in the org, and I can just pull that one change. So if I go in here to code and open that up, and I'm just going to do something really basic like add a comment to a file. And we should have some Apex classes, of course. And there we go. And we'll say this is a comment, something completely pointless, SFDX force. Should I use so I like my alias is just DX push, right? But it is force source push. There we go. And that's going to go, and it'll take a little while. This is not an insignificant repo, but actually there is only just the one change, so it shouldn't take too long. Oh no, I take that back. I've not pushed to this org yet, so this will be a little bit of a moment. But the way the way the Source Sync API works is as you change, it tracks it locally. As you change remotely, it'll track that as well. Now, if you're going to use a sandbox, it's a little bit different because with sandboxes, okay, there we go, so that's up now. With sandboxes, here we go. I need to make that a little bigger. And we'll shrink that up a little. And clear that. So SFDX force source deploy is what we're going to use. Now, for my sandbox, I believe it was called -u source-sbx. And then I can go in and specify a path, I believe, is -p. Actually, you can type in a -h anytime, and it'll tell you. So yes, -p. There we go. And so -p, and then I can say go to force app. Okay, why isn't that working? Oh, I know why. Actually, I'm just going to go and use the previous one. There we go. So -p, force app main default, -u source SBX. And now what this is going to do is deploy everything that is actually in my source directory. Now, that may be a bit of overkill sometimes, right? Maybe you just changed that one Apex file, or maybe you changed just the CSS in a Lightning Web component. So it is possible to go in and explicitly specify just a file, just a Lightning bundle, just an Apex class, as opposed to this sort of catch-all basket of deploy my entire directory. So there we go. So that's deploy. On the other tab, I have push, right? Source to push. There's really, there's not much difference in what's going on here. In both cases, we're taking your metadata. In the one case with the deploy, we do have to transform it into a metadata API compliant structure, but we do that for you, and then off it goes. In the other case, we're using the Source Sync API. We're still using the metadata API underneath the covers, but we will track those changes for you. So whether you're using sandboxes, whether you're using Scratch orgs, you have an option for getting your changes made. In addition to that, one of the great new features that's been added is there is a support report that says these are the features that we currently support and where we support them for metadata. So you can go check that out in your org. All right, anything else we want to do here? We did deploy. A couple of other little nice tricks to have up your sleeve. Who here has ever been not logged into any org, but we're just wondering, what are my current limits? Yeah? So there is a command for that. So if nothing else, you can go home and start using SFDX, force, limits, API display. And then you can do this against any org. So this is going to go against the default org. But I could also do it against my sandbox, for instance. So -u source SBX. And that's going to go off and get the current limits for that org. If you're using bash, then using something like grep to pull out the actual limit you want so you don't have to look through all of them is really handy. There's something called select string in PowerShell that does the same thing. So for instance, if I want to see all my hourly ones, I could just simply go grep hourly, and then it'll go off and it'll just show me those hourly ones. So this is kind of what I was talking about. If you string some commands together, this is a really basic one, but you can start to get more for your money. All right. So the last thing I want to talk about is, some Apex. So one of the features I really like is the Apex log tail feature. Now, in using command lines, tail just allows you to follow the output of a file, and that's essentially what's happening here, except the file is it's your log file coming from the server. So SFDX force. Actually, let me clear. It's easier to see if it's up high, isn't it? There we go. SFDX force Apex log tail. And actually, I'm going to use -u df19 demo, because that one actually has everything in place, including my permission set, including all of the data, and in addition to that, the metadata, of course. So there we go. So what that's going to do is just open up that tail, and then I can come back here and execute some anonymous Apex. DX force Apex execute. And it's almost like a REPL. It's not really. But so I could do something really basic, like account, my account equals new account, name equals Dreamforce. And then make sure I terminate that. That looks good. I get so used to it. And then if I go and execute that, does that look good to everyone else? I swear, even writing simple code, you can make little mistakes. There we go. So executed successfully. And why is that not? Oh, you know what? It would help. Let's try one more time with the right org. So -u df19 demo. And then we'll do same thing. Account ACCT equals new account name equals Dreamforce. And actually, for good measure, maybe I'll just save that as well. So insert ACT. Okay. Control D. And it's still not coming up. Ah, there we go. So now that's a really basic bit of code. One thing that I think is a nice trick, though, is that if you output the tail to a file, so for instance, if I go here, Control C, I do the same thing, but then I say write to output.log. What is going to happen is it's going to regularly write to that log. Then you can follow that file and do a grep on it and see errors and that sort of thing. So it's not as nice. It's sort of a quick and dirty if you don't want to set up your Apex debugging, but you just want to quickly see what's going wrong. You can just output things like errors and that sort of thing using a little trick like this. Now, if you really need to get into some debugging, I strongly recommend the Apex replay debugger. Anybody can use that in your sandboxes, in your Scratch orgs. Really useful. But for a little bit of quick and dirty debugging, this might be really handy as well. So we only have like half a minute left. So let me quickly wrap up the slides. There we go. Now, mostly for reference, I have slides that address a lot of the things I talked about in here. So where do you go to set up your profile? What's the auth URL look like? How to do limits? Data management commands. I didn't even get to these. But if you think about it, everything in your org is data. And so if you need to change something and it's available to change via the API, you can fiddle around with this. There is one, though, that is kind of a bugbear, and that is we don't surface the regular API update or upsert or delete. It's all done through bulk. And so what that means is a really cool trick you can do to clean up unused private reports. But you can do the export using your command line, but you'll need to use a proper data management tool like Data Loader to delete those. There is an article in the knowledge base that talks about how to do that. So, what else? There are existing features to interact with sandboxes using the commands. Where they don't exist, sandbox info are your sandboxes, and sandbox process tracks sandbox refresh processes. So you can always query those, or you can actually just do an update on sandbox info if you want to refresh a sandbox, for instance. That's really handy. And then, of course, remember, users are data as well. So just to review, there's lots of things we can do with the API, really cool stuff. I talked about the reports. One thing that I've never written up, but I think it'd be a nice little shell script, would be to do mass email changes to sandbox users. Or, maybe somebody wants to write that up as their very own Salesforce CLI plugin and open source that. I'm sure we'd all love that, wouldn't we? OK. Like I said, I'm out of time for questions. However, I will be out in the corridor after this session, and I'm happy to talk to as many of you as I can. So there's a few links in here for Salesforce DX stuff. Thank you for coming to this very first talk of Dreamforce 2019. Have a great Dreamforce, everybody.